part of the product development cycle. And the most sophisticated data teams, they look like software engineering teams. So what do I mean by that? There's a VP of data. VP of data is basically a VP of product. And that person manages a series of other PMs who are writing PRDs, and they're receiving feature requests from primarily internal constituents on Jira.
You are listening to The Secure Developer, where we speak to leaders and experts about DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and much more. The podcast is part of the DevSecCon community, found on devseccon.com, where you can find incredible dev and security resources and discuss them with other smart and kind community members. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we have a really fun conversation and a really different lens than what we've had before. We have Tom Tunguz, who's the sort of founding partner of Theory Ventures. We'll hear more about that in a second, to talk a little bit about AI from an investor lens and about AI and AI security in particular. So, Tom, thanks for coming onto the show.
Privileged to be here. Thanks very much for having me, Guy.
So Tom, maybe just for starters, tell us a little bit about yourself and Theory Ventures, give us a bit of context to your views of the world.
Yeah, so I've been a venture capitalist for 14 years. I was at Google for 3 years before that, worked at a company that went public when I was 17, started a little software company and fell in love with technology, loved the incredibly rapid learning curve. And about a year ago, left my previous firm to start a new one called Theory. And we're 6 people today. We spend a lot of time in and around AI. And we build a super concentrated portfolio. So the idea is to find companies through extensive research and then back them and continue to back them and continue to back them, and primarily help very technical founders build out their go-to-market strategies.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then Theory is I guess, kind of as the name implies, it's about the deep thesis on a domain, and AI being, I guess, kind of an area. I mean, that's a pretty big title on it. You spent some time, I guess, exploring the domain probably before the ChatGPT craze.
Yeah, I mean, so I remember when I was in grad school, there were 4 sections to the machine learning book. There was classification, is this a dog or a cat? There's prediction, which is what will stock price be tomorrow? There's a natural language processing, bag of words, and all that, named entity extraction. And then the last was, it was always the last part of the chapter, and the professor said, you need to know this, but it doesn't really work, and it's neural nets, and maybe one day.
Yeah, one day.
Over the last 20 years, we've seen each one of those technologies really have its day in the sun, and now it's clearly the last one.
Yeah, definitely the neural networks. Although there's some NLP involved, I guess, kind of in the AI. It's NLP, neural networks performing NLP on data. Cool. So, we'll dig a little bit into AI security, and we've got a bunch of things to talk about there. But maybe I'd love to just get your help classifying AI a little bit. You just gave us these 4 types of them. But when you look maybe from today's landscape and you look at types of companies on it, how do you divide them, the AI related companies?
Yeah, so I think it's a classic 3-layer cake. You have the infrastructure companies where there's databases or vector databases. You have the large language model foundation companies. You might have a tooling around that, like vector computers, which is really important, RAG. Then you have the developer platforms. And so you want to run a private model and you want to run it on a VPC, like a Google Vertex or Amazon Bedrock, kind of call that like platform and then you have the applications themselves. And I would argue the application tier, just the same way that every company became a mobile company. Like if you look at the old venture websites, people used to have on their bios, like, I invest in internet, right? So it's an absolutely absurd assertion today. And we're kind of in this phase now, this transition phase of we invest in AI. But the reality is that the application layer in particular, we're just investing in software.
Yeah, and AI kind of needs to be embedded. So I guess, but some people kind of lean a bit more into sort of the AI, I guess, disruption, into sort of, whatever, applying a new solution approach to a problem domain because of the sort of new power, that has become available through AI.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think, and the way I characterize the application layer is we're sort of waiting for the AI native moment. And what I mean by that is when the mobile app store launched, all of the initial applications were little websites websites stuffed inside of the iOS chiclets. And it took Foursquare and Uber to reimagine those applications in the way where they used the accelerometer or they used the GPS and they were mobile native. And I think most software companies today are sort of the first, and we will see a raft of companies that start from the first principles and reimagine applications entirely AI first.
Yeah, I like the mobile native approach. I guess I haven't really thought about mobile as much. I've been thinking a lot about cloud native and how I guess it's maybe like the same trajectory, but it's more about how do you operate a company versus the sort of the interface, which is, I guess, what you're highlighting. But it's sort of similar. It needs to be, you could have used the cloud as in I shifted and lifted and sort of I'm running it, on a virtualized infrastructure someone else is running versus locally. And then there's the actual kind of cloud native, which is, it's whatever, it's elastic, it's taking advantage of all these capabilities. It's, a different development process, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so you have these new features which might change the billing. One of the things that we've been debating at the application layer is you have these very classic demarcations between software. You have CRM software and marketing software and customer support software. What if you use an LLM to kind of combine all that, right? And reconfigure these categories to try to capture more share.
Yeah, that sounds confusing.
Yeah. Especially if you have existing budget line items and now all of a sudden you're trying to reconfigure those, that's tough, as I'm sure.
Yeah, you're still going to need to tap into one of those. So from a security lens, I think security probably touches, like I'm sort of hearing maybe two takeaways, One, like, I guess if I'm building AI security startup, if I'm building something that really its job is, I want to help you secure AI related functionality that you're adding up, that would fall into the second bracket, into sort of the dev tools.
That's right. Yeah. So there's a lot of demand there. I mean, we live this stuff every day, but the future is here. It's unevenly distributed. I would argue LLMs are so unevenly distributed at this point. We came across some research, I think it was Morgan Stanley, less than 3% of the global 2000 have touched a large language model. We host dinner with buyers. We had 2 dinners with 12 buyers and only one of them had touched it. And the main dynamic inside of enterprises today, or at least the one that we've been able to capture, is the board and the CEO are pushing hard. We need an LLM strategy. I'm sure everybody in the audience has heard this. Yeah. And internally, whether it's like the CISO or the VP of data, they are worried. They're worried about data loss. They are worried about the lack of determinism within these models, the hallucinations and the impact of making poor business decisions. They're worried about these models being co-opted. I mean, you just saw Meta released an open source bot that 3 days later had to be shut down. Microsoft had Ava. And these things are like humans where you keep telling them a certain thing and they'll learn and they'll evolve. And so there's a whole security apparatus that needs to be created. And today it's buried under this moniker of governance. And the funny thing is, I ask everybody I meet, what does that word mean? And nobody can tell you what it actually means. And so we're trying to distill, like, is it data loss prevention? Is it like model drift? Is it observability? Is it compliance? Is it legal? And I think we need to get to that next level of granularity to be able to answer that question. Yeah,
for sure. And we might explore that a little bit over here, but it's interesting. The governance, to an extent, it's just like a responsibility layer, like use it, but do it responsibly. Sure, I'll have some governance tools, so I'm responsible. I'm sort of doing it correctly.
And then we were asking ourselves, I think it was on Monday, do software engineers is there like a governance software that exists for classic software engineer? I mean, it sounds absurd, right? Like, sure, there's like SOC 2 and ISO 27001 and all those like certifications, but there's no governance tool.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, in security, oftentimes it's referred to as security governance on it. So I guess to an extent, and it's under security, and I think it had more time to brew the sort of the terminology. Not sure if it's any more crisp or sort of clear, like security governance is probably, there's a few better definitions. The other takeaway, though, that I take is, and we'll probably sort of explore both of those in more depth in a sec, is if every company, if it's like mobile, it's like internet, it's like cloud, then probably if you're a security person, like you better get on it in terms of understanding what are the security implications of AI. Because I guess the answer that says, oh, in my company, we don't really use AI is probably either a short-lived or an incorrect statement.
That's right. I think the dynamic here is, I remember when Dropbox first started and heads of security blocked it. And they said, we don't know what this is. We have to stop it. But employees, personal computers, mobile phones, it will leak into the organization. I think it's inevitable. And the attack vectors that exist for these models are different and important enough that it's worth getting up to speed on.
Yeah. And I think it's a point. It's sort of the reason I've been doing a bunch of sort of chapters or guests here, episodes on AI security is because, of the same conviction, which is we all need to form an opinion on it. And sort of the pace of adoption, and sort of interesting indeed to hear your view. Like my sense was that the pace of adoption, if you were to contrast it to cloud, maybe mobile, is faster. Maybe the value proposition is more immediate on it. Maybe it's just the hype and sort of the range, maybe the ease of implementation. But even sort of despite the stats that you mentioned right now in enterprise, like how many enterprises were embracing cloud? How many of these 12 enterprises embraced cloud within a year of it being launched?
I mean, count on one hand, maybe. Right. And you look at Microsoft's latest quarterly announcement, they went from 12,000 to I think 18 or 19,000 enterprise users of some form of the technology, whether it's Copilot or the new Clippy. And so I think the thing that's different about like the cloud wave, but is similar to web and mobile, is the press is interested in it. The press writes about. And so as a result, it's a phenomenon like I haven't seen in a really long time, where Thanksgiving Day dinner, we're not talking about Bitcoin this year. We're talking about AI, right? Like, what is the bot that you're using? What are you doing? How are you saving time at work? What funny meme can you generate out of Midjourney?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So and it permeates. And I guess in that sense, it is a little bit more like internet or like Bitcoin, consumer ready. And it's not like cloud, which is a back scene. Not that many people really know about it. And there was an attempt, I think, when the cloud came out of talking about it, and but it's just sort of too hard to explain.
Yeah, it's too amorphous. I mean, even the word cloud came later, right? And whether it was like ASPs or software as a service, people are what are you talking about? But this AI stuff, you can go on Bing or Google, or you can play
feel it for yourself. So maybe let's sort of explore, especially sort of that first category of sort of AI security. I guess it sort of touches both. So again, kind of maybe sort of investor lens here, and you're saying a bunch of companies, or you're hearing from buyers and companies, what is it that they worry about? When you hear about AI security, what type of kind of categories or concerns jump up? And I don't know, whatever lens you have on, does it come from startups or does it come from buyers?
Yeah, so the first need is data loss prevention. That's what everybody is worried about. Some non-public information being used to train a model, or it popping out elsewhere. You look at the launch of the GPTs from OpenAI on Monday, and with it one quick command, you could get access to the entire underlying data set. Classic example of total data loss prevention. DLP is a category. My understanding in talking to buyers is that is a tainted acronym, where historically has been a category underperformed and people have been really disappointed. So I think there'll be a new wave of data loss prevention from LLMs.
Something different, so they're not tainted by previous total market size and things like that, but effectively it would be data loss prevention.
Exactly right. Yeah. The second category, I would call it like LLM endpoint, which is I'm an individual user with an enterprise. I want to use a model. The CISO or someone inside of the business wants to control which model I use, and then wants to run some scan both on the input and the output of that model, right? So and this touches a little bit into the DLP side, but maybe I want to check for, is the Copilot assistant reproducing copyrighted code that violates some law someplace? Are there budget limits or rate limiting that's then imposed at that particular place? Are there sort of compliance concerns? So if I work in finance.
Yeah.
And so there's both like at the infrastructure layer and then at the endpoint layer, I think you'll have two different solutions.
Just to sort of delineate those a little bit. So the first one is more about trust with the data leaving my boundaries. So it's more, I gave OpenAI, I copied my data, my data has been transferred to OpenAI, and then within the OpenAI interfaces, the admins and all that, they might have access to it. The second is more about the sort of the end user giving data, and is that correct? But also like how much you're sort of trusting the output. So it's sort of less the setup, less the sort of the infrastructure indeed, and more the day-to-day use.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. I mean, just to sharpen that point a little bit, I can think like data loss prevention. I think I want to use a cloud model, or I want to train or fine tune my own. How do I control the data that's going in there, and I make sure that it's in a safe box? And then the second is my employee is the risk vector, and how do I bubble wrap that person? Yeah. So those are two. And then there's a third category, which is around compliance, right? EU has different laws around the right to explainability. A lot of these LLM models do not have that. And so for like mortgage scoring or credit decisioning, we'll have to come up with a solution. And so those are the three categories so far that we've been able to identify. The fourth one, which borders on security and data, is It's basically like data access control. We don't really have a great name for it, but it touches LLMs, but it's not exclusive. But especially with like marketers are going to need certain amounts of data in order to fine tune whatever model they're producing. Let's say it's to produce 1 million ads a month, right? And the customer support teams will want access to data to be able to create robots that respond to customer support emails. And it seems to me like there's a missing layer that's like, it's not row level access control, it's not RBAC, but there's this like data approval, like access approval. I mean, maybe it's PAM, privileged access management for data, something that looks like that, where all of the assets, all the data assets of a company are put together, and then there are workflows about the ongoing management that tie into compliance and tie into different departments. That needs to be built.
And it sounds like, and I think I relate to that, which is to an extent, you can kind of paint all four under a data security mantle, one being on almost like sovereign, of like, okay, do I give that data? It's for training, it's for large bulks of data that have left the perimeter that I secure on my own. The second is around sort of the flow of data between users and the LLMs and back again, and how trustworthy that data also, which is leaked. If I leave compliance to the end, that sort of third one you talked about is access to data that is within the system, and, with prompt injection, to an extent, any data the LLM knows, any user of that LLM, might know. So how do you prevent that? How do you define that? The data is amorphous. So how do you even define who's allowed to know what, let alone how to enforce it? And then the last one is, okay, there's a bunch of regulations around this stuff. How do I demonstrate that I've done what I needed to do for all three? Is that
beautiful summary? Yeah, it's my blog post.
It makes sense because AI is all about data and the security of it. I am seeing, I think your characterization is one that I buy into, from like the concerns and the problems. From a solution perspective, there's in the world of cloud security, to an extent, mobile security and such. But if I think of this more as infra, there's also a delineation of stage, and maybe simplistically, you can talk about sort of the AppSec side, hey, I'm building something. Am I doing it securely? Am I building a secure thing? And then there's the SecOps side of when I operate it, how do I know if someone's attacking me? Do you see those, or is the industry just not there yet? They're sort of still thinking about the basics, and so they're not thinking about those tools?
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. Like talking about like RASPs and security operations centers, like DDoS attacks on LLM bots and that kind of stuff. That's happening to some extent, right? I think Google just published some research that is suing some group that was using Bard maliciously. So it's starting to happen, but I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, it's probably just sort of not yet the concern of some of those because they haven't actually had the mileage as much. I think there's really interesting, like when you geek out about it a bit more theoretically, I think you're conveying what you're sort of actually seeing in the real world on it. And maybe I'm a bit more in theory land, but when you think about the complexity of SecOps, then it's really hard. Like, how would you know in this sort of probabilistic world, how would you know that you're being attacked? How would you like identify that it's an attack? When it is an attack, what type of forensic information do you need available to you? And what types of like mitigation tools would you have? So say like, an attack is happening right now, maybe you can kind of cut off a user totally, but like, is there other kind of mitigation type capabilities you can do? And so, I mean, I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. I mean, just to click on that point, you can imagine, these systems spit out logs, right? And so do those logs end up going into your SIM or whatever sort of analysis framework you have? The other challenge with it is one of these requests that hits an LLM is like 10 to 50 times more expensive than a regular page load.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can imagine DDoS attacks are actually bankruptcy, right? Yeah. They're just trying to reduce the infrastructure costs. And so maybe, a mitigation mechanism there is you fall back to a caching layer that's just serving these, or like it's shadow banning certain IP addresses or accounts where you're serving them off some much less expensive infrastructure as opposed to hitting the LLM each time.
Yeah, that's actually like a really interesting point on it. When elastic infrastructure came along and even serverless, I had one talk in which I talked about denial of wallet accounts. Effectively, you're sort of, you're allowing the service to come along and you're sort of getting the company bankrupt in the process. But serverless was cheap. And
$3, we were calculating, some of these requests are $3 a request. And so, you imagine like 1,000 QPS at $3 a request.
No, you can definitely cause damage on it. It might be a little bit just sort of for fun, or sometimes, there is kind of actual financial gains from getting a company to suffer, but it is a super interesting vector. And I guess on the build side, I'm curious to hear a little bit of your take on the personas involved. So maybe I'll share a concern I hear. So some security leaders that are a bit further along, they recognize the fact that they have a challenge around collaboration with their data science teams. If you think about the AppSec side, they've built for a while now, they've built a relationship with the development teams. Some are working better, some are working, not as well on it. Now they suddenly have this like new constituent that existed in the organization in sort of the dark corners of the org in most companies. And they teach with this sort of super expected data, and they come along and they tell them, you have this, like, so where did this come from? Well, I don't know. Like, I never really, we have the data. It's okay. That's all we sort of need. We can assess it. Or a lot of these organizations don't even have, these data science organizations don't have a documented and structured development process and manipulations. They modify stuff in production. So, freaks them out, I think, somewhat legitimately.
Yeah.
What do you see around ownership, like for that tooling layer, for that infrastructure layer? Like, is it those data science teams that are coming in? Is it the hardcore, hardened platform teams that come in and say, well, I'll own the data tools, and these data science folks, they will follow them because I know how to use those responsibly with governance? I don't know, it's like a bit of a long-winded question, but like, who do you see owning the AI tooling within companies when they're purchasing?
Yeah.
Not necessarily the budget owners, but like the actual product owners.
Yeah. Okay. So I think you're hitting on a really important trend, which we talk a lot in the data world, which is historically, you've had the developers build an application, the application produces data, that the data then moves into a cloud, like a data warehouse. And then you have the data team that does like post hoc analysis. After everything has happened, let's analyze what happened. How much money did we make? What are click-through rates? And what's been happening over the last decade, but suddenly has been increased by LLMs, is all of a sudden you need that data within the application. Right. And so this data team is now thrust to, instead of being post hoc, they're actually like part of the product development cycle. And the most sophisticated data teams, they look like software engineering teams. So what do I mean by that? There's a VP of data. The VP of data is basically a VP of product. Mm-hmm. And that person manages a series of other PMs who are writing PRDs, and they're receiving feature requests from primarily internal constituents on Jira.
Yeah.
And they are starting to commit code to GitHub. The problem is, unlike regular software, you have two different assets that you need to manage when you're in data. There's the code itself, and then there's the data. And so like the versioning of the data. And so there is some like software infrastructure, look at like Iceberg and Project Nessie, where you can like version and roll back and fork just the way that you would think. But that's really, that's
standards
really,
around data versioning. Like
it's like day one. I mean, anyone, top of the first. And so that's starting to happen. But I agree with you. I mean, I think one of the most important dynamics within the security world is the CISO and the head of data will become far closer than they ever have, because you could argue it's at least equally important to the partnership between the CISO and the VP-Eng.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I guess there's an interesting timing question on it. First, I'll ask a question. Are there kind of rising stars within the data tooling world that is helping kind of convert those sort of teams to being something that is a slightly more structured development process? And I guess maybe what's your view on the willingness of the data teams to adopt it? Because the tools will come, but the practices take longer to change.
So there is a lot of demand. I mean, you must be very familiar with that figure eight, the DevOps figure eight.
Yeah, the infinity loop, indeed. Yeah.
So there is now a data ops figure eight. And so you can think about, okay, there's planning. And I put this together, this table, which is, here's what's happened in DevOps. Here's the parallel in the data world. So you can think about like the PRD. Well, there's this idea, or like SLAs. So sorry, let me take a step back. So one of the big trends in data in the last world is called data mesh. Well, what is data mesh? That's microservices for data. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Breaking down.
It's like a service mesh, yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. So now each individual team produces data. Okay, so once you start producing data, well, what do you need? You need to tell other teams how frequently you're producing that data. What is the format? What's the SLA? Great. Okay, so that's an SLA in the DevOps world. What do we call it in the data world? It's called data contract. So there's a company behind that called Gable. In the DevOps, there's this notion of containers within DevOps and CI/CD, and how you and I can both be working on a particular piece of software. And if we write a conflicting thing, there's a merge process. There's a company called Tobico Data that's doing this for data. So you and I can both be working on a data pipeline. I write a breaking. We have ephemeral developer environments that understand the semantics, understand what the breaking changes are. we merge them into a beautiful way. Just the way that there's a Datadog for infrastructure monitoring, there's now data observability. Monte Carlo is the leader there. What's happening in the pipeline? So each one of those 8 or 9 steps in the DevOps figure 8 now has an equivalent, sometimes a little different, but mostly equivalent with vendors. So that stack is starting to happen. But could I tell you that there's been a single CISO that's involved in any of those procurement conversations?
Yeah, probably.
Like having invested in that category for the last 6 years, I don't think they've ever been a constituency. But in the next 5 years, no doubt, they will be.
Yeah, but it's an interesting model, though. Like, I think that's a good articulation of the journey that the data development or data engineering community is undergoing. So to an extent, maybe a starting point for someone looking to secure these things is to say, okay, I understand this phase in the data pipeline. Can I relate it to the software peer? And then can I ask, what did I do around securing that phase? And by proxy, try to apply that to that data phase.
Yeah. And the parallels are very strong. Very, 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 very strong. So it should be it's just every time there's a new world that comes up with the same concept, they give it a different name. It's just about learning the links.
Yeah. And eventually they merge together. That's super interesting on it. And do you think, you kind of mentioned committing code to GitHub on it? I know a company called Doug's Hub. They're sort of trying to do, I think there's others that are trying to be a GitHub for the data. Like, do you think there is a budding world, a collaboration tool, maybe even open source tools that might challenge GitHub?
I don't think so. Like GitHub, it's hard to put big files on there. There's like large file service, which is great, but a lot of these files are just gargantuan. I mean, it's kind of like asking, would you ever put your Datadog, the logs that you put in Datadog, into GitHub? It's just like, it's not really designed for that. The way that the data world is evolving is that S3 and R2, that's the storage on Amazon and Cloudflare, that's where people are dumping data and starting to manage it. And so there are open source abstractions. We talked about Iceberg. The idea behind, so within a regular, you can imagine a database like an Excel spreadsheet. And let's say you had 1 million Excel spreadsheets in a folder, and they each had 6 columns. And all of a sudden, we need a 7th column that's like column A plus column B. And what you have to do today is you need to write a script. And all the classic scripting problems, right? You that finger, a plus versus a minus, and you need to roll back. And so what these open source systems do, like Nessie and Iceberg, is to say, okay, add a column version. And so I think those will exist outside of GitHub, and the data storage place will be S3 or R2 because they're so cheap relative to alternatives. And you'll probably have this separate system. Now, how GitHub and those systems talk, TBD.
Yeah. So the code can still be versioned. They need the data versioning capabilities next to them. It won't be stored probably in the same system. But there might still need to be sort of collaboration capabilities around that. Some, easier UI in which you don't go and browse a file list on S3. And then there needs to be migration, which I guess, again, comes back to GitHub. So there's some mix of the code.
There will be some mix.
And what about, so in the world of software, there's been reuse in open source. And so from a management and from a security perspective, it's very important, it's very valuable for software to have been packaged as, here's the version of this piece of software on it, even registries over time that evolved on it. I see nascent elements to it, but like, what are you seeing around open data? And is there some sort of nascent sort of packaging standard of it so that whatever like I have the security hat on here, and I'm saying, that would be very useful to be able to tag a piece of data with whatever assurances I think I can apply to it. And when it does a black, I can start worrying and inspect it a bit more deeply.
It's a great question. I mean, you can imagine for a regulator, you need to prove that a machine learning model given a particular set of data produces a particular outcome. So you need to match the model version with the data version. Both of those can change independently. There's no link between them today. People are starting to talk about this idea. There's a company called Patch that's doing data package management, so NPM equivalent, where I can say, this is the version of the data which is on this particular day. The format is frozen. Data continues to update. But it's not there yet. But it's absolutely essential.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So from a security perspective, I guess maybe taking it back to the customer lens on it, like how much are these security concerns actually holding back enterprises from adopting it? Or is it sort of the business drivers too strong and they're running ahead and the CISO is being told, figure it out because we're going?
So I would say for large language models, it's definitely holding it back. there's a real concern. I mean, like a CISO, I feel for them because if they make a mistake, like often your job can be on the line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because, well, the downstream impacts can be huge. In the world of data, you could botch an analysis and you won't be fired. But now all of a sudden with these LLMs, it has changed. And the heads of data know this, right? Because they've seen, they've been probably hacked like 5 times through their hospital and all that kind of stuff. And so they realize that all of a sudden, all this data is now everywhere. And until they have a high degree of confidence that all the data they're using is public, and if it were to leak, it'd be no big deal, or there's a governance/security layer that exists on top, I think they'll be very reticent, unless they're incredibly sophisticated.
I guess how much are they looking for assurances from the platform they're using versus dedicated tools that would give them the right capabilities? Like how much of it is OpenAI telling you, I'm not going to use your data, or giving you whatever RBAC controls over it versus, some LLM guard that, you need, that you run the
Yeah. So 4 months ago, we were talking to a publicly traded company that was building on top of OpenAI, and we were asking them how they were managing their data security. They had 2 different answers. The first was they had every query that went to OpenAI was intercepted at the network layer. They ran a regex for social security and credit card numbers and stripped that out, right? So state of the art. And then the other thing they did is somebody would log in once a week to OpenAI and hit the delete personal data button. So, his stuff is new, right? A lot of the
what are they looking though? Like, are you sort of hearing narrative that say, hey, I need more secure LLM platforms and that would address my problems? Or are you hearing them say, I want to buy, like I will also seek a secure LLM platform, but I need dedicated LLM related, AI related security tools?
Yeah, I think it will be both. The core platforms, like Microsoft has pushed aggressively, like VPC equivalent for OpenAI. Google has Vertex and Amazon has Bedrock. And those have assuaged some of the concerns around the first category we talked about, which is uploading my private data into something that I control and then training a model from which only I benefit, which produces intellectual property. And I think at the core infrastructure layer, that part will be managed by hyperscalers. But all the other categories that we talked about, like data loss prevention and those kinds of things, I think there are huge opportunities for startups to come in and build businesses there.
Yeah, I agree. And I guess it's all about sort of the timing element. And it sounds like probably the biggest value unlock that you can provide for the companies at the moment is the unlocking of being able to use the LLMs. And we're seeing that, like we're a specific slice of it. We're still seeing companies being fearful of using Copilot because of a variety of security concerns, and does it produce vulnerabilities and things like that. And so oftentimes they look for solutions like Sneak to be like a guardrail. Say, okay, fine, I'll condition you can use Copilot, it's okay, but you'll put it not, I can explain why that's a wise move, but I'll also admit that many of them are they're not deep in their area of expertise. So they know they need to have a security guard. They know it needs to not get in the way of the individual, in this case, developers who are doing their work. But it's not necessarily that they fully mapped out the threat landscape and they sort of said that this is the thing I worry about the most. Right?
But I don't think anybody knows what it is. You know what I mean?
That's fair.
We're all right. Yeah. We're all creating this right now. We're all learning from each other. And so I think you're right. Like, if I were a buyer in this category, I would look to a trusted partner who could tell me this is what's important and this is what isn't. And I want to deploy something, and over time I can optimize and figure out actually this particular attribute or this particular threat vector is more appropriate for me. But today it's just like, but
do something. But you have to do something. You have to get in the game. And so, like, if you're a security person, you need build a theory, understand it's going to be imperfect, do something, get in and continue to scrutinize. Don't think you're done because you've embraced it. Yeah. And so how much do you think about, you mentioned in a variety of sort of recent newsletter messages, you mentioned the notion of constellation of models. In general, there's like a stronger, if I understand that term correctly, there's sort of it's like the multi-cloud conversation over it of like, would you really just use OpenAI, or would you really just use sort of the one, or should we really brace ourselves to doing it? Like, that's very important for security in terms of priorities. What are you seeing enterprises lean towards? What's your prediction in terms of those?
So it's really early days. And so when a company PM just wants to get started, they'll use OpenAI and they'll say, great, I'll use the most expensive, most comprehensive. Let's just get it working. And then what happens over time, and like the bleeding edge companies, they move from OpenAI and then they'll take an open source model and then they'll train it. And then what they'll notice is, okay, this model is really expensive to operate. There are 3 or 4 actions, like let's summarize some text or extract some data from a PDF or autocomplete code. And they will take smaller models. So you have large language models, and then you have small language models. And most of them are open. I mean, many of these are open source. And so the most sophisticated companies, now what they have is this constellation of models. One big model where an input comes in, I don't recognize it, or it needs a lot of compute, goes to the big model. A second prompt comes in and says, okay, PDF extraction. Okay, let's route it. So now there's a routing layer, it identifies what kind of query is this, classifies it, and then it sends it to the right model. And then there's even now starting to be, and this is very, very early, a caching layer, which is, I've seen this before. So you can imagine, how do you say a bagel in Russian? You only need to hit the LLM once. You don't even need to hit the LLM, but you only need to hit it once and then you can cache it. And that time to live can be decades because that's not going to change.
Right. Yeah.
So, okay. So now you have a query comes in, there's some kind of a routing system, there's a caching layer, and then there's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different models that are being deployed and managed. And then that's.
And you foresee, like, those are maybe today, it's only the sort of the very advanced companies that apply that. But you anticipate that pattern will emerge everywhere because
I think so.
And aspect of it.
The costs, right? At like $1 to $3 a query, even with massive ACVs, you just cannot. You think about like Microsoft and others are working on security configuration products, right? So you deploy a new WAF and you can type into the chatbot, how do I configure my rules around like port forwarding and all that kind of stuff. Actually, it's probably not the right layer, but anyway, you get my point. And that's a really expensive thing. And so like for $20,000 ACV, if you're operating, you're probably talking about 10 to 20% of gross margin impact as a result of a lot of these LLMs being put inside of products. And so people will push against that and try to improve the margin structure. And this is the way.
That's really interesting. And that's, I guess, a motivation, like probably sufficient motivation in its own right. And then on top of that, you have just the competitive pressures of, it could be that one model is better than the other. It could be that one division has opted into one thing and the other division in the enterprise. So CISOs, one of the challenges in the world of security is that while developers like depth, and the sort of individual teams might sort of say, this stack is awesome, I'm going to use that. And any things that just work with that stack, I don't care about the other ones because it's not my problem. Security people, they need to cover threats. It's not practical for them to deal with the same threat in like 7 different tools and 7 different sort of dev teams. And so they need things that cover breadth. So it might be another reason to sort of maybe bias you in favor of external security tools that give you an assurance that spans these different stacks. Yeah.
Exactly right. You nailed it.
So typically startups don't go straight to the enterprise. They go and they kind of feed themselves, if you will, or they build up their product indeed on sort of smaller companies, on startups that are advanced in some adoption of new technology. So if I was an AI security company today, in a classic, if I a cloud security company might go to, early or mid-market companies that are more technology adopters and try to sell them some of the cloud security solutions before they go to the giants that are very hard to satisfy. Like those smaller companies today, do they care about AI security at all? Like when you look at the startups or sort of the pioneers that already are startups, but have embraced AI, how much do they, like we talked about how much enterprises care about AI and that it's a holder, how much do these mid-market and early stage companies care about that have adopted AI in more full force? How much do they talk about or was concerned about security?
They care enough about it to satisfy SOC 2, I guess is the way that I'd put it. But there's nothing, I guess that's a question, like, will the SOC 2 regulations change?
Yeah.
Or the expectations change as a result of LLMs? Yeah. The other dynamic is this like whole GDPR data processor. And so a lot of them are wondering, I guess, selling to the enterprise, how do I architect myself that I'm not a marginal data processor? That's another really important component to this.
Right.
Those are the 2 areas I've seen it pop up.
Yeah. So they basically, I guess it's all a sophistication type element. Their customers will ask them about things that they know to ask them. And so the very, very basic things they'll sort of ask them about. But beyond that, they don't really care to. It's a bit of, on one hand, super compelling. On the other hand, a pretty tough world for sort of an AI security company today. Might need to go to the top or to the sort of the more security sensitive people more so than the more technology adopters.
Yes, exactly right.
I'm curious. So, like, slightly veering out of security, but relevant and applicable to security as well, as the flip world. We talked about how the world of data needs to embrace software development processes, but AI and LLMs are also changing how software will be developed over time. And, you're sort of deep and immersed in this sort of space. What's your prediction to how AI-powered software development looks like in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, like intentionally in the long run, not the sort of simple code completion or prompt that generates some code?
Yeah, I think we will see assembly to like an interpreted language. You think about going from effectively zeros and ones to high like level object.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to see an even bigger jump with AI because the reality is, 50% of code contributed to GitHub already is machine generated. I read code. Most of the code that I write is so formulaic and it's always the same thing. And even, this week I can upload, OpenAI just announced I can upload a zip of my repository and then ask the model to refactor across classes. And let me contrast this. So 4 months ago, I could ask the AI to complete a line for me. Yeah. And then maybe 2 months after that, I could say, write a function for me. And now I can say, write a class for me, a whole document. And now we're at the point where, and I haven't tested it yet, but like refactor across multiple classes. And so within the span of 9 months, let's call it 10 months, a year, you've really gotten higher and higher level of abstraction. I think the other really interesting dynamic around these like code agents is I learned, for me, one of the hardest things to understand has been a hash map, or like how to use this function in Ruby called map. I just look at the syntax and I feel dumb looking at it. It just does not click. And then when I code, like it does it for me. I'm like, oh, that's the way that it works. So I think that's really important, where you'll see more and more people within an enterprise coding, people who might be sophisticated in Excel or, slightly technical languages, who are now all of a sudden doing like real applications. So yeah, the amount of code that we will start to produce will just grow by 100x, maybe 1,000x.
Yeah. And if you're a security person, that is a very scary statement.
Yeah.
Especially when that code is not necessarily as vetted, right? Because it might be someone who just knows Excel that can now produce, 10 files of Python. But what is their ability to scrutinize those files to say, for starters, that they're probably able to scrutinize that they're doing the right functional thing to a reasonable degree. But security, that's a much harder thing to spot.
Yeah, are they using the right encryption algorithm? What are they doing for like key rotation and
even just sort of straight up vulnerabilities, right? Are they sanitizing input that sort of moves from one point to the other?
SQL injection, all that.
And when
stuff.
you have vulnerability, if it's not composable, like if it's not components, then that vulnerability will now be basically duplicated across like 50 different instances versus being able to know that this sort of shared library has a vulnerability on it and everybody else just needs to update.
Yeah. That's right.
It's a scary proposition on it. I do agree though with your sort of prediction, which is abstractions will get higher and higher. Software development will become more democratized. I come back a little bit to sort of almost like the GitHub disruption. Not saying, it might be GitHub themselves that do this, but I think when you imagine that world of very high abstraction layer, but still need some form of versioning, data sets that you need to run, and they do need some form of versioning, but it's no longer code. To an extent, like some of the stranglehold that existing source code repositories or communities on it might be diminished now.
Yeah, absolutely possible.
Yeah. So I guess we're in startup world, so everything is disruptible on it.
What's the next juicy target?
Yeah, I don't know that GitHub is an easy target, by any stretch. But it's interesting to think about that software. I share your view of kind of switching to being higher level abstraction, a bit more sort of specification driven. But maybe this is back to the equivalence in software development and data, which is something needs to structure this thing, just producing vast amounts of wild code. At some point, you don't want to know the code. You just want them to generate functionality, and you want to manage the functionality somehow and not know if and what code exists underneath.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe you see sandboxing of these applications again, right? And particularly because somebody built an application with an LLM inside, it's very difficult to instrument to understand exactly what's going on. And so you need to look primarily at inputs and outputs.
Yeah. The exciting aspect of it is that you get to potentially reinvent the whole software stack of it.
Yeah, that's right.
The transition that it kind of gives you a little bit of security shivers in the process. Tom, this has been an awesome conversation. Really enjoyed it. Before, I think we're kind of coming up on time here. Before I let you go, I'd like to ask you my typical ending question over here. So if you could delegate, outsource one aspect of your job to AI, what would that be?
It would be calendaring. So I look at a calendar and I feel like I lose 100 IQ points. I mean, it's such a difficult problem. I would love for email inbox to schedule. Done. Great.
With like not just sort of the schedule and coordination, but the sort of the wise time management aspect of it, right?
Cluster everything, figure out the travel time, look at the weather, figure out like whether she and Biden are going to be in San Francisco on Wednesday.
Yeah. Well, that would be, sort of optimizing. I think it's interesting that, like your answer right now, I feel like a lot of answers rotate around the admin of life. Let me just do my job and sort of get this thing. That is a compelling part that everybody likes to spend time on.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much, Tom, for joining in and sharing this sort of views. I think it's a very fresh lens and very interesting to me, and I'm sure to everybody listening.
So fun to be with you today. Thanks again.
And thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
Thank you for listening to The Secure Developer. You will find other episodes and full transcripts on devseccon.com. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and don't forget to leave us a review on Apple iTunes or Spotify, and share the episode with others who may enjoy it and gain value from it. If you would like to recommend a guest or topic or share some feedback, you can find us on Twitter at DevSecCon and LinkedIn at The Secure Developer. See you in the next episode.